Oswald walks his last mile. His assailant moves in from the right.
In the fall of 1963, Americans learned that Inajiro Esanuma's on-air assassination was merely prologue. It's a curiously anonymous moment for the newly famous Lee Harvey Oswald. At large and wanted for murdering President John Kennedy, Oswald ducks into the Texas movie theater in Oak Cliff, Dallas, clumsily ensuring his own capture when he fails to buy a ticket for the feature being shown. War is hell. At first blush, this seems an odd tactic for someone hoping to elude the police, to corner oneself indoors rather than find a fast way out of town. But maybe this isn't a bad strategy, even if it doesn't ultimately work for Oswald, because a movie theater offers a good place to hide. It's a large, dark room where everyone faces the same direction, which lets one lose oneself in the crowd. It's typically filled with empty seats one can slouch down in, and it provides a hypnotic light show, the movie, that distracts everyone in it. Oswald's hiding place can be thought of as an oxymoronic metaphor, an attempt to elude celebrity in one of the places where celebrity is made and given to us. But it's possible to imagine a simpler impulse that may have drawn the panicky Oswald to look to the theater for salvation. Maybe he's acted out of nostalgia for the anonymous feeling one gets at the movies, that almost nihilistic comfort of knowing that all eyes are aimed where yours are and none is aimed at you. In the movies, I've always had the irrational but undeniable impression the outside world's been hung in suspense, that these 90 minutes or 2 hours will lapse without incident as the story unfolds. And wouldn't that have been nice for the fugitive Oswald just then, to be able to hang reality in suspense, to pass 2 silent, uneventful hours in the dark? Did he think in some childish way that the movies might protect him? 3 days after Oswald seeks freedom by watching in anonymity, he dies on the screen with everyone watching when Jack Ruby shoots him live during a prisoner transfer. He's gone from spectator to spectacle, and the process has killed him. Oswald gets what he seemed to want when he ducked into the Texas theater in the first place, to be swept up into the screen and away. But the screen grants his wish the way the devil does in folklore, writing his undoing into the fine print of the agreement. You don't have to stumble on a terrible place to be afflicted with terrible thoughts. February sees the publication of Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, which sells 1 million copies by making a convincing case that the suburban home is just as abysmal in its own way as the mad scientist's remote lair. Friedan claims that the domesticated lives of so many middle-class American women are not the fulfilling terminus of biological destiny, but frustrating subsistences foisted on them by male-centric social expectations. So much for Colonel Graham's insistence that procreation is the sine qua non of the female experience.
I suppose you think that women should only cook and sew and bear children?
Isn't that enough?
Instead, the American suburbs are as much a wasteland for women as the void of outer space is a place of growth and discovery. In June, no thanks to NASA, the capsule Vostok 6 makes cosmonaut Valentina Tereshkova the first woman to leave Earth's atmosphere. The year after the movie version of Manchurian Candidate came out, Betty Friedan observes that society has long had available evidence to deduce the human psyche was capable of being hollowed out, just as the Chinese had apparently done to its use as prisoners. Women, she maintains, have been suffering just such a fate in America since time immemorial, but unfortunately, in a sexist society, such spiritual malaise won't be collectively acknowledged until observed in men. The shocked recognition that this passive non-identity was something new in history came, and only came, when it began to show up in boys. But the apathetic, dependent, infantile, purposeless being who seems so shockingly non-human when remarked as the emerging character of the new American man is strangely reminiscent of the familiar feminine personality as defined by the mystique. Ensnared in lives of dependency, in which their labor is implicitly expected while rarely explicitly acknowledged, and the only role available to them is that of outwardly content suburban housewife, modern women are prototypical, according to Friedan, of a new state of being in post-war America, that of passive non-entity, an apathetic, dependent, infantile, purposeless being who seems so shockingly inhuman. The Korean prisoners, she concludes, in this sense were models of a new kind of American, evidently nurtured in ways inimical to clarity and growth at the hands of individuals themselves, insufficiently characterized to develop the kind of character and mind that conceives itself too clearly to consent to its own betrayal. Where she refers to a model of a new kind of American, though, she betrays her own point. This new American isn't new at all. She's been here all along. In the matinee circuits, there's no shortage of evidence for Friedan's conviction that possession, what she calls ego failure, a collapse of identity, is different for the boys than for the girls. Where men suffer ego failure, it's at best a situation for remedy, at worst, as in the Manchurian Candidate, a political or ideological threat. But when women experience collapse of identity, the question at issue tends to be less political than ideological or metaphysical, so that Ruth Simmons is transformed and Bridie Murphy into a semi-willing psychonaut. And in She Creature, Lombardi uses Andrea as a guinea pig for his experiments in past life regression. But this isn't ultimately the cause of her ego failure. Rather, it's due to his effort to sexually enslave her, which she is thankfully able to resist in one of her few remaining acts of will. Where men who fall under the influence of hypnosis, drugs, possession, or any other form of psychic challenge to their identity tend to seem absent from their own bodies. The telephone repairman from It Came from Outer Space, and Shaw and the Manchurian Candidate. Ruth and Andrea become, as it were, spread out. No longer themselves, they become several souls at once, and one soul in several. A few weeks after Feminine Mystique hits the shelves, General Hospital, episodes 413, 415, and 417, Short Subjects, debuts on ABC. It's an object lesson in Friedan's thesis that career women in popular media live harried, hollow lives. Their circumstance is as much a function of the careers they've chosen as the fact that they've chosen careers. Jessie, RN, and her newly wedded husband, Dr. Phil Brewer, both work long shifts at the Institute of Healing referenced in the show title. They both have complex pasts, and Phil, in particular, is plagued with residual feelings for Cynthia, an erstwhile flame. When we first see them in Hospital's pilot, they're just missing each other in the reception area as Jessie consoles a burn victim in 712, and Phil chases after requested meds for the coronary in 723. Their lives are so tangled in one another that they scarcely intersect. Hospital work makes demands, and the fact they've elected to work as well as live together is just as likely a reason as Phil's wandering eye for their rocky marriage. What is the enticement career woman Jessie's travails offer for the East Coast housewife tuning in to General Hospital at 1 p.m. weekdays in early spring 1963? Contemporary psychiatry holds both the state of being housebound and that of being hospitalized to be forms of affliction. The psychic life of modern individuals wavers between somatic symptoms, getting sick and going to the hospital, and the visual depiction of their desires, daydreaming in front of the TV. These afflictions, though, are of roughly opposite sorts. The threat of radical disruption looms over the typical hospital stay, the potential for a terminal or life-altering diagnosis or the failure of treatment to dispel a malady. Thus, Angie, disfigured in a fiery drunk driving accident, grieves the loss of her looks and the possibility all the powers of the hospital's plastic surgeons might not restore them. Martha, to whom Dr. Hardy needs to deliver a hiatus hernia diagnosis, obliviously reveals her affliction's likely cause by presenting to him fretting that it might be something worse.
But I'm worried.
She telephones to her husband, who happens to be a doctor as well, and attributes her symptoms to simple indigestion.
I want to be absolutely sure that there's nothing wrong.
Here is the perfect illustration of the true and the psychosomatic affliction, or more properly, the difficulty in differentiating between the two. Angie's doctors repeatedly remind her that she's lucky to be alive and that her injuries will have no lasting consequence other than their effect on her appearance. That's when Hal Moffat becomes the creeper, though Angie's disease is an emotional manifestation of her narcissism rather than a sapping of her true vitality. She still has the wholeness of body to repeatedly trash her hospital room, just as Hal, though plainly ill, has the strength to commit multiple violent murders. Martha's illness proves real enough. Dr. Hardy acknowledges hiatus hernia as a challenging diagnosis, and it arrives already contested by Martha's doctor husband, who thinks the pain is simply in her mind. Is the worry her hernia's symptoms generate likely to lead to worse diagnoses in the future? In short, are any of these afflictions real? Are any, for that matter, imagined? And what of the women watching at home? What sort of illness is a life of quiet desperation? The consummate gratification promised in playing the role of wife and mother may have proved illusory, but that doesn't mean the life of a careerist is peaches and cream. In part, this trope is just patriarchal propaganda, sure, but professional ambition inevitably takes a toll on one's home life. Both Phil and Jesse manifest this irreducible truth. Phil is more vocal about it, and in ways that reveal the fundamental imbalance of the field he and his wife are playing on. He complains that they're eating hamburgers every night because Jessie, whose duties leave her just as beleaguered as he, has neither the time nor the jouissance to conjure up dishes of more gustatory variety.
Only thing is, you don't eat as much as I do or as often,
he complains. It's statistically true that women eat less than men. On the other hand, social pressure to maintain a lean figure has long been greater on women. Then there's the curious assumption that though the two of them are working commensurate hours, she must be the one to make the evening meals. Even with Friedan's ideas being new and unfamiliar, this surely seems galling to more than a few of the housewives watching at home. In the pilot, Phil gets it in his head to paint the town. Honey, we haven't been anywhere or done anything in years. And Jess acquiesces.
You want to go?
I'll answer the foolish questions after you put on your basic black and a ribbon in your hair.
Look, we can meet later, and you'll have time now for primping or whatever you have to do, huh?
Here, Phil openly acknowledges the greater demand placed on women to tend to their appearance. He does it, though, almost automatically, the way a Manchurian candidate might recite a treasonous speech corrosive to democratic virtues. He's immune to the poison of his own discourse, the way it inoculates him from the advantage he gains from needing to spend less time on his appearance. He speaks for himself not so much as his advantage speaks through him. Jess reminds him he has an important presentation the next day. He insists he's prepared. He reprimands her.
You think I should stick to my knitting as usual, huh?
Jesse's anguish manifests more symbolically and then more circumspectly. Generally charged with making meals, a burden she bears without complaint to the same degree Phil unloads it on her, she prepares a congratulatory cake to commemorate Cynthia's engagement to one Dr. Martin. Cynthia, we'll recall, is the callow lass who we fear has captured all of Phil's true romantic interest. True to her hamburger-a-day nature, Jess bakes a brick of a solid white cake with congratulations inscribed in a perfect half circle across the top of its circumference, a single candle puncturing it dead center. It would have been helpful if Phil had picked up earlier that this woman clearly hates to cook. The single candle sends the whole party into tumult. Why the one candle? Well, to tell you the truth, I've never given an engagement party before, and I don't know whether it's appropriate. She seems like she's bluffing. One candle, one engagement for Ken and for Cynthia. First and last engagement comes Ken's redirect for us both. Jessie has stepped over a customary boundary, purely by accident, mind you, and must be corrected. We should wish them a long life, Jessie recites as Cynthia blows out the candle, and many children. Eric cuts her off. You shouldn't say that out loud. It may not come true. It's too late. Cynthia tries to scatter the spell by appealing to reason. Phil was just quoting, superstition, Kenneth. But the sticky powder of dark magic has already been released. Eeriness now saturates the proceedings as Dr. Martin toasts Cynthia with an imaginary glass. What is this strange procession of ill omens? As Phil drives Cynthia home and the two reignite their own flame, Jessie prowls the apartment, finally tossing the neglected cake down the kitchen wastebin. Her thoughts as she paces alone are left to the viewer's imagination. The Alien Invasion movie in its current form has been around for a while now, since at least 1950 or so. As it has developed and changed, it has maintained a sexless quality that has proven to be part of its power. These works certainly have perverse sexual tension of a sort. One need only recall the alien probes and invaders from Mars to realize that. Still, the nudie cuties, overt attempts at titillation, and the frank, adult-oriented themes of potboilers like Peyton Place and Where the Boys Are largely absent here, at least until The Creeping Terror, episode 606, comes along. This movie is perverted. When the titular alien monster eats a bikini-clad picnicker in its signature scene, the camera fixates on the spectacle, devoting so much time to it one suspects a little liquid courage was involved in Terror's editing process. The slug-like beast gobbles up the gambling lass down a gaping orifice that opens just where its amorphous midsection meets the ground, thus making it a mouth of a sort, but it could just as easily be an anus. All the slug would need to do is move in reverse and swivel its head. The movie features several of these man-eating attacks, culminating in a slaughter at an eclectic community dance hall, but in these attacks it's the girls who get all the attention. When the camera fixates on a stockinged pair of legs kicking and twisting as they slowly vanish into the Terror's slavering maw, this is the movie's tell. The long static take might be the signature of the neo-realist, but it is also the exploitation movie maker's bread and butter. That said, the movie also telegraphs its fetishism by not displaying it too forthrightly, which is to say these scenes are conspicuously unrealistic. The savage creature looks more like a thick beach blanket than anything else. Springs with apparent ping-pong balls glued to their ends stand in for eye stalks. The hungry mouth is a simple cutout with remaindered fabric stitched to either end to mimic curtains of extraterrestrial flesh. There's a tangible reason for the amateurishness of Creeping Terror's special effects. Jilted after going unpaid for his labor, the designer ran off with the original creature, and the crew had to make do with a hastily assembled stand-in. The real has its counterpart in the imaginary, though. The lack of realism in these scenes makes the fetishistic enactment possible. To render these attacks too convincingly would be to abolish their alibi, make them so clearly fetishistic as to dispel the dubious pleasures, even for the fetishist. In the context of Creeping Terror's storyline, these attacks are geared neither to sustenance nor to sating some bizarre sexual want on the part of the invader, but to learning about the human race. The aliens plan to use this knowledge to aid an upcoming attempt at total conquest. There's an intriguing alignment of human knowledge and consciousness with quantitative physicality here, a more the better sense that information is a tangible presence inscribed on our gray matter. On one level, this is a continuation of the developing metaphor by which information has come to be predominantly understood as a series of bits written on a ribbon of magnetic tape. But it also has a fetishistic dimension. The sex act has long been seen, for better or worse, as a transaction of information, whence the law speaks frequently and often, cringingly, of something called carnal knowledge. But there is a literally asexual dynamic at work here as well. Asexuality, the deriving of libidinal pleasure from observing or participating in asexual phenomena, being a necessary component of the fetish. If the movie's hand-me-down creature resembles a lumbering carpet or a slug, then it also resembles an amoeba. And we all learned in biology that amoebas reproduce asexually through cell division. They also nurture themselves through the opposite but otherwise undifferentiated process of phagocytosis, that is, extending pseudopods to envelop and absorb their food, With the discovery of DNA, all such processes can now be thought of as having a libidinal component, as well as being transfers of information. Creeping Terror was shot intermittently over the preceding years at Spahn Ranch, a dreary, dusty locale outside Los Angeles. In the last decade, the ranch's arid look made it a favorite location for low-budget westerns, but recently it's fallen into disrepair as this genre has fallen into disfavor. The decision to shoot there was only one of many deftly economical moves on Savage's part. Though his flaws are many, besides his sexual misdevelopments, he is also a violent psychopath and pathological liar. He was still able to create a more or less full-length feature film for around $35,000, which is more than most of us can say. Another of Savage's many strict economies is to use already existing technologies to stand in for hand-designed speculative ones in staging the alien spaceship's cockpit. The crew jury-rigged the ship from a scrap of salvaged metal, decked out with standard oscilloscopes, Geiger counters, and the like. Plainly, the movie makers pulled the shrewd move to spare themselves the cost of paying a designer and all the materials and labor needed to fashion custom control panels. Unfortunately, such attention to design plays an important part in making science fiction film believable and controlling the messages it delivers. Today, the Earth Stood Still's lovingly rendered saucer with its hands-free controls being only the most conspicuous example. When we're asked to believe that the aliens in Terror use immediately recognizable Earthling-based equipment, by contrast, we scratch our heads. Is this foe or friend? Upon first encountering the makeshift craft, the local police deputy and the movie's rugged male protagonist wonder something similar.
It's no airplane.
Could be one of our missiles.
Or one of theirs.
You could be right, honey. Don't think we have anything this big.
Never mind that the mock-up really isn't all that big to begin with. The pair have no reason to perceive the ship as anything other than a mishmash of strictly standard instrumentation, except that the movie's premise demands it, all of which impairs the audience's ability to suspend disbelief, but underscores a familiar, often subtextual or inadvertent theme frequently found in films of this kind. It was brewed in the public unconscious after the military conducted the Manhattan Project outside the purview of America's enemies, but also, by necessity, its own people, and has fermented over the following years as we've watched America and Russia engage in ongoing, potentially deadly military competitions. All these competitions revolve around technologies few really grasp: intercontinental rocketry, orbital satellites, supersonic flight. In July, the president announces the existence of the SR-71 spy plane, an advancement over the U-2 that can fly higher and faster, reducing the likelihood of its detection. But maybe the only reason to reveal the plane's existence is that the Soviets have, in fact, already detected it. For as long as a new flight technology is successfully kept from an adversary, it behooves military planners to keep it a secret from their own civilian population as well, maintaining its status as, in essence, an unidentified flying object. Thus, friend or foe dilemmas proliferate among eyewitnesses. Weather balloons are allegedly mistaken for alien castaways, jet fighters for deft Martian craft capable of seemingly impossible maneuvers. Discoverers of crash sites featuring unfamiliar technologies must now speculate as to whether these technologies are free or communist, Earth or alien, sane or mad. Consciously or not, they must, by necessity, also wonder whether the difference is even germane anymore. The U.S. Air Force's research project continues apace in Starfighters, Episode 612, an affable recruitment asset shot on the proving grounds of California's George Air Force Base. Young Witowski and Stevens, newly minted pilots, are featured in an extended takes flying training sorties over the same California desert EGA so recently called home. This all happens in the context of tepid courtships the pilots have struck with Mary and Betty, Midwestern girls who've come out to the coast in search of career, education, and social advancement. Not so much plotted as given this scenario to let play out, Starfighters later has Witowski spur with his father. The congressman would rather his son pilot bulky and boring long-range bombers instead of the lithe fighters that stimulate him so. The film concludes with the melancholy pilots shipping out to West Germany, there to fulfill their Cold War destiny. Most conspicuous in Starfighters is the forensic quality of its endless flight sequences. Over and over, Witowski and Stevens drop napalm bombs on a clearing in the dunes, said training sessions being rendered in a coarse montage. For minutes at a time, their F-104s float in the air as their pilots struggle to nestle the fuel nozzles in their noses into the basketed hoses, meting out the fuel. They take off and land, then take off and land, and take off and land again. In their off-duty conversations at the local bar, Witowski and Stevens make much of the number of airtime hours they need to log before they can achieve certain sought certifications, and Starfighters seems determined to show us every minute. These scenes are evidently cut from raw nose cone and cockpit reels, repurposed for extending the movie's running time to something like that of a full-length film. As we watch them, the questions abound. Why are expensive napalm bombs being dropped in training exercises presumably meant to judge and hone a pilot's accuracy and make him more adept at executing the steps in a bombing run? Why in particular are refueling sequences featured so prominently? A good guess at the former is that it's the effect of the weapon, not the skill of the pilot, being tested. One at the latter is that the Air Force, continuing the strategy regularized in World War II of supplying long-range bombing runs with fighter escorts, is retooling its flight planning to enable 24/7 bomber presence in Arctic and NATO airspace. Psycho has changed the way America thinks about highways, and highways figure, if only momentarily, in one of Psycho's many low-budget imitators, The Atomic Brain, episode 518. Originally made for TV 2 years before under the title Monstrosity, Atomic Brain centers around a wealthy elderly woman's quest to cheat death by hiring a mad scientist to transplant her soul into the body of a beautiful young woman. All this work transpires at a terrible place, namely the woman's isolated estate, in whose lower recesses the scientist maintains a laboratory devoted to this purpose. But as the movie opens, Dr. Frank's experiments in brain transplantations have so far failed, and the aging Mrs. Hetty March is feeling the pressing urgency of death. Still, Dr. Frank's work has progressed to the point that he is ready to start experimenting on human guinea pigs, and so he and Mrs. March place a phony ad for a housekeeper, thereby enticing 3 young immigrant women to the house to be used as unwitting subjects. Mrs. March's servant, another partner in crime, Victor, picks up the women at the L.A. airport, and a montage follows conveying the foursome's car from the city to the country, first over the busy highway and through a nest of overpasses by day, then over narrow, hilly country roads at night. Meanwhile, the movie's narrator in sleazy voiceover describes Victor's reaction upon meeting the women, one of whom, if all went according to plan and Mrs. March's brain transplantation was successful, would soon become his sex partner.
Making love to an 80-year-old woman in the body of a 20-year-old girl is insanity.
The narrator points out, quite sensibly. It's the one scene in Atomic Brain that introduces any conventional urban environment to compare with the sepulchral March estate. The land of highways is the site of the immigrant women's ambitions. At least one, the Londoner B, aspires to a Hollywood acting career. And once it becomes clear that Mrs. March and her hirelings are up to no good, it stands as the place to which the captive women hope they can escape. Victor's trip to the city reinvigorates his moribund conscience, if only somewhat, as the narrator enumerates his misgivings. He feels uneasy about the whole affair, we're told, as the car heads down the Hollywood freeway and back out of the city. But by the time the car pulls up to the gate leading into the March mansion, these misgivings are gone. It was unpleasant to think of what was going to happen to these girls, explains the narrator, spelling out Victor's train of thought. But a man has to consider his own future. What would happen to him if Heidi were to cast him off after all these years? The trip from the city to the country is the clearest indicator of what is, in the movie, a matrix of opposing pairs. Under the broad rubric of urbanness are subsumed the positive categories of youth, that of the immigrant women, candor, B and her culturally dislocated compatriots, the Viennese Nina and Mexican Anita, are trusting to the point of naivete and seem congenitally incapable of telling a lie, and daylight, that of the bright exterior shots at LAX and on the Hollywood freeway. Standing in contrast under the broad rubric of ruralness are the three corresponding negative categories. The first, age, is evidenced not only in the decrepit Hetty March, but also the disconsolate Victor, given as he is to referring to himself as an old man during bouts of binge drinking. In response to candor, we have subterfuge and, obviously, the duplicitous scheme of Mrs. March and her unethical hirelings. And last, we're given darkness, as virtually all of Atomic Brains' exteriors at the March estate are shot day for night, or in the dusty light of dusk. The ultimate effect of all this is to make the estate and its environs feel like a kind of tomb for the ailing Mrs. March. Early in the movie, this feeling is evoked literally, and as a result of March's very effort to cheat death, as in one of the movie's many Frankensteinian scenes, Dr. Frank and a werewolf-like sidekick, the failed result of an attempt at brain transplantation, sniff around a nearby graveyard for corpses to experiment on. After Nina, B, and Anita arrive at the house, much of the movie is given over, despite its scant 72-minute running time, to long periods of moody silence as Mrs. March hobbles around sourly, or Nina, who eventually crystallizes into the movie's heroine, sneaks about the mansion's halls trying to figure out what's going on. Watching along in that gloomy silence, listening to the voices ring through that terrible house, it's hard not to imagine the silent death always prominent in Mrs. March's mind. It's not a matter of whether the movie's director, Joseph Mascelli, meant any such association. It hardly seems likely, but then again, it hardly seems to matter. In Atomic Brain, the void hangs in the blank spaces between words. Those who remember the Mad Doctor's ill-fated attempt to revive the dead in the classic 1931 Frankenstein will notice how far its 1950s and 60s imitators have veered away from their inspiration. In the beginning of the James Whale film, Frankenstein's monster is a fait accompli. The only stage of the process that remains is the actual spark of electricity that will bring it life. We know Dr. Frankenstein's creation is a mishmash of body parts he and his assistant Fritz have gathered on a series of grave-robbing expeditions. But the movie makes little of this, and the fact that the creature's brain has been transplanted into a different body is indicated merely by the monster's trademark scars. The seam spanning his skull at the forehead, and the flat crown meant perhaps to facilitate the transplant by allowing the open brain pan to lie flat and still on the operating table. But what Frankenstein gives short shrift, Atomic Brain turns into a fixation. Where in Frankenstein the hunt for flesh is mere prologue, in the Atomic Brain it's basically the whole movie. Perhaps eager not to repeat Frankenstein's mistakes, Mrs. March refuses to rush her decision. She patiently scrutinizes Nina B. and Anita's bare backs and pokes at them with a long cane while making lewd comments about their bodies, either in real time or through the narrator's account of her stream of consciousness. Among Mrs. March's trenchant observations about the trio are that they are
so nicely rounded in places men like.
Nina, she says, is
perhaps not as spectacular as the English girl, but in excellent taste.
Mrs. March's job applications even include bust, waist, and hip measurements. Avarice supposedly guides the wealthy Mrs. March's conduct here, she being engaged in a careful review of the items on offer in the hopes of finding the youngest, healthiest body into which to transfer her aged brain. But on screen, it frequently translates into a kind of softcore pornography. One thinks superficially of Lombardi's lecherous designs on Andrea, but Atomic Brain feels particularly licentious. Not only, for today's critics at least, because of its undercurrents of lesbianism, but also because of the cynical way Mrs. March sexually exploits the three immigrant women. She prods and ogles them in an ostensibly titillating fashion, but in fact all this fondling completely lacks libidinal investment. She hopes to pick the most sexually alluring of the captive women, but only so she herself can be alluring after she takes over the woman's body. The brain transplant movie has changed quite a lot since Frankenstein. Mad scientists have been swapping the noodles of the unsuspecting in such various titles as Donovan's Brain, The Head, The Brain That Wouldn't Die, 1962, episode 513, even the classic Warner Brothers cartoon Water, Water, Every Hair. The signature images of these movies, leathery, respirating brains in jars full of bubbling water, hapless subjects strapped to gurneys as mad doctors gear up to throw the switch that will swap their selfhoods one to the other, have become iconic in a more general sense of science fiction at its cheesiest. If space exploration movies like Forbidden Planet were largely inspired by the hope that atomic power would someday yield a kind of perpetual motion machine and thus enable interstellar travel, the brain transplantation movie borrowed heavily from the idea that splitting the atom would spur paradigm-shattering advances in medical technology. Such cheerful predictions appeared almost immediately after the bombing of Japan, as commentators presumably struggled to uncover a silver lining to this dreadful new weapon. Thus, the February 1946 New Republic enthused that radioactive isotopes would help scientists learn more about the processes of life, and thereby postpone death. In 1947, Collier's went even further, foreseeing cures for hitherto incurable diseases, and an innovation that had opened the door to a golden age of atomic medicine. Later, in 1956, science writer William Lawrence quotes a Dr. Maurice Tainter as claiming that, in this golden age of medicine, we've conscientiously evolved a technique and a scientific philosophy that finally enabled us to wrestle with death itself, and on increasingly even terms. The Duchess's dream, it seemed, stood on the verge of being realized. In fact, such sunny predictions were so prevalent that some observers claimed freedom from want and mortality might cause the human race to grow idle and undirected, like the narcissistic alphas and betas in Brave New World. After we've read all the comic books, wondered University of Chicago Chancellor Robert M. Hitchens in the late 1940s, traveled all the miles, seen all the movies, drunk all the liquor we can stand, what shall we do then? A decade and a half later, and separated from Hitchens' writing by a major Asiatic war that had led General MacArthur to contemplate A-bomb strikes against North Korea and China, not to mention a tense nuclear standoff with the Russians over Cuba, Atomic Brain is nowhere near so sanguine about the prospect that atomic power might cure humanity of death. Dr. Franks' experiment, it should be noted, never quite succeeds. However, if the movie doesn't embrace Hitchens' idea that nuclear-powered immortality might engender a tyranny of leisure, it preserves at least a variant of Hitchens' warning that a utopian imagination can promote idleness, loss of purpose, and self-infatuation. Wealthy beyond want, Mrs. March seems content to dawdle endlessly about her estate in a languid dotage. She walks excruciatingly slothfully, is never seen laboring at any task or running any errand, and never considers the immorality of exploiting the immigrant women or enlisting the dark sciences, simply to evade death. Most evildoers in movies of this type at least delude themselves that their nefarious deeds will benefit humanity in some way. And Dr. Frank makes up for Mrs. March's lack of conscience with a double helping of messianic megalomania. He's nevertheless quite content to execute his research at a glacial pace. He diddles around making fatuous speeches about his own importance and aimlessly puts the brain of a cat into Anita's head after a blotch on her back causes Mrs. March to reject her as a test subject. Mrs. March occasionally musters the energy to complain about Dr. Frank's lack of progress, but never very emphatically. Victor, for his part, mostly sits around getting drunk. Likewise, when Nina B. and Anita arrive at the March estate, they find themselves forced into a kind of captive inertia. Mrs. March pretends to have hired them as domestic laborers, but when Nina actually tries to do some housework, Mrs. March scolds her to stop lest it stain her hands. As much as it is a try at immortality, the spinsterish Mrs. March's scheme seems to be a gambit for a second chance at progeny. The film never reveals the details of whatever plan the trio have concocted that prompt Victor to speculate about making love to an 80-year-old woman in the body of a 20-year-old girl. But it seems safe to speculate that Mrs. March hopes, among other things, to bear a child with her new body. In She Creature, the threat to fertility must likewise be not only thwarted but repressed. Had Lombardi had his way, Andrea would have lived out her childless days under his spell, and for this he must not only die but have his secret die with him. In this year's Devil Doll, episode 818, the containment of life's mystical secret is even more literal. Like Lombardi, the great Varelli, Devil Doll's wicked magician, mesmerizes a beautiful woman for ungentlemanly purposes, and like Lombardi, in the end he's hoisted on his own petard. Since his dalliance in the arcane is to discover a method of transferring human souls into ventriloquist dummies, his comeuppance is naturally to be entombed in his own doll for the rest of time. Atomic Brain's conclusion is virtually identical. In a melancholy fit of conscience, a drunken and sentimental Victor alerts Nina to Mrs. March's true designs, which nearly enables her to escape. But Mrs. March learns of the betrayal and thwarts Nina. Ultimately, the poor woman is strapped to a gurney in Dr. Frank's laboratory and things look bleak. But Dr. Frank, in another betrayal, puts Mrs. March's brain in a cat and lets Nina go free. In a final betrayal, Mrs. March, as a house cat, improbably manages to trap Dr. Frank in the laboratory and activate a self-destruct mechanism. The March mansion crumbles, House of Usher style, and though Mrs. March escapes, without the doctor in his laboratory, she is consigned to live out her days mute and anonymous, trapped in her feline form. It's moments like these that make the brain transplant sci-fi movie subgenre unusually susceptible to ridicule. Still, there can be little doubt that these movies engage a significant question, the mind-body problem having concerned philosophers since antiquity. Part of the reason people think these movies are so campy is that they take such a modular view of human beings. Implicit in the exercise is the idea that the soul is a discrete component of the body and can be excised whole and stitched into a replacement, where it assumes a commanding position the way a driver takes the wheel of a car. The core presumption here is of the soul's symmetrical immutability, the core process much like that seen in the Bridey-Murphy cycle of reincarnation films. The only difference is that some undefined deity or force of nature guides this process in the search for Bridey-Murphy, She Creature, and the undead, as well as keeping its existence hidden from the mortal world. Whereas in Atomic Brain and the other soul-swamping movies, the mad doctors see in science and technology a way of taking control of this process, a way of reaching, so to speak, into heaven.